Somewhere in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, there is a piece of land so remote that the nearest inhabited neighbor is over 2,000 kilometers away. And yet, for over 100 years, scientists have been asking a question that refuses to die. How did the people who built the giant stone heads on that island get there? For decades, the answer seemed simple, too simple, because now DNA is telling a different story, a story that does not just add a detail. It rewrites the entire migration map of the Pacific, and it drags a continent into a mystery nobody expected. For most of the 20th century, the accepted version of Polynesian history looked like a straight line. People moved out of Asia, island, hopped across the Pacific in a slow, steady wave, and eventually reached the most isolated corners of Oceania. Clean, linear, uncomplicated. It was the kind of story that fit neatly into a textbook paragraph. But here's where it gets worse. When geneticists finally had the tools to actually read the DNA of Polynesian populations, instead of just tracing pottery shards and language patterns, the clean line didn't hold. It split. It doubled. And it pointed toward a history far messier, far more violent in places, and far more astonishing than the neat narrative anyone had been taught. Think about what that means for a moment. An entire origin story, repeated for generations, treated as settled fact, and it turns out the genome itself disagreed. Researchers examining Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA across more than 400 Polynesians from 8 island groups found something that should not have been possible if the old single migration theory were true. Nearly all of the Y chromosomes and mitochondrial DNA they analyzed traced back to either Melanesian or Asian ancestry, but the split was nowhere close to even. And that imbalance was not random. It was a fingerprint of something that happened on the journey itself, something the old story had completely erased. Here is where the drip of information starts to matter. The mitochondrial DNA, the maternal line, was overwhelmingly Asian at roughly 94%. But the Y chromosome, the paternal line, told a completely different story, with the majority tracing back to Melanesia. Read that again. The mothers were Asian. A huge share of the fathers were not. That is not a footnote. That is a signature of an entire chapter of human history that got left out of the official version. A chapter involving contact, mixing, and very likely a shift in whose blood carried on and whose did not. So what actually happened? The genetic pattern lines up with something researchers call the slowboat scenario, and once you understand it, the earlier textbook version starts to look almost naive by comparison. Long before Polynesians existed as a distinct people, populations moving out of Taiwan and island Southeast Asia, the ancestors we now associate with the broader Austronesian expansion, did not sail straight across open ocean into the remote Pacific. They passed through the islands near New Guinea first, and they didn't pass through quietly. This is where the picture darkens. The data suggests that as these seafaring populations moved through Melanesian territory, something happened that skewed the ancestry unevenly between men and women. Scientists describe it as a pronounced bias toward more Melanesian men contributing to the gene pool than Melanesian women, a pattern consistent with local customs, where a woman's community, not the man's, determined where a new family settled. In practice, that means Asian women moving into these communities, and then their descendants, carrying Asian maternal lineage but increasingly Melanesian paternal lineage, eventually pushing onward into the remote Pacific. The people who became Polynesians were never a single population sailing out of Asia. They were already a blend, forged through generations of contact most people have never even heard about, before a single canoe ever reached a truly remote island. But that's only the first layer, because when scientists went further and looked at whole genomes rather than just the Y chromosome and mitochondrial markers, an even sharper picture of where most of that Asian ancestry actually came from started to emerge. And it wasn't some abstract Asia, it pointed somewhere specific. Researchers studying the ancient cultural hub of eastern Polynesia found that more than 70% of the ancestry of these island populations traced back to island Southeast Asia, with the lowland populations of the Philippines standing out as the single largest identifiable source, the Philippines. Not a vague Asian origin, a specific traceable population whose descendants would go on to help settle some of the most remote islands on Earth. And here's where the story escalates again, because the mixing didn't stop after that first wave. The same research uncovered evidence of a second, later collision of populations, a secondary migration event moving out of the New Guinea region and pushing into western Polynesia during a period roughly 1900 to 1200 years before present. This means the ancestors of Polynesians were not shaped by one migration and one moment of contact. They were shaped by at least two, separated by centuries, layering additional Melanesian ancestry onto populations that had already made this journey once. Every time researchers dug deeper, the simple story cracked a little more. What most people are not seeing when they hear the Polynesians came from Asia is that this sentence hides an enormous amount of violence, negotiation, intermarriage, and multi-generational movement compressed into 6 words. The real story is a population forged in transit, shaped by the very land bridges and island chains it was supposedly just passing through on its way to somewhere else. Now here's where the story shifts from where they came from to how they actually got everywhere else, because this is the part that turns a migration story into something closer to a logistical mystery. The Pacific is enormous. Islands are separated by hundreds, sometimes thousands of kilometers of open ocean. And somehow, without satellite navigation, without metal tools, without written maps, small groups of people reached almost every habitable speck of land across an ocean covering a third of the planet's surface. How do you even begin to reconstruct that? The answer, again, turned out to be hiding in the DNA of the people living there today. Researchers analyzing genetic segments unique to Polynesian ancestry in 430 present-day individuals spread across 21 different Pacific Island populations realized something remarkable. The pattern of shared DNA between islands functioned almost like a travelogue. When a small group left one island to settle another, rare genetic variants in that founding group would spread and amplify in the new population, leaving behind a kind of genetic timestamp of exactly when that specific journey happened. This is not chaos. This is strategy. Except the strategists left the map written inside their own descendants' genomes instead of on paper. And when scientists finally reconstructed that map, the timeline was staggering. The genetic trail shows voyagers launching from Samoa and western Polynesia, sailing south and then east, and reaching Rarotonga in the Cook Islands by around the year 830. Then it kept moving. From there, the expansion accelerated even further east, into a chain of small islands called the Tuamotus. And from that single point, groups fanned out across one of the most extreme stretches of open ocean anywhere on Earth, colonizing islands separated by thousands of kilometers of nothing but water, all within a window of roughly 500 years. But here's where it gets worse, or rather, more astonishing depending on how you look at it. That single point of dispersal in the Tuamotus wasn't just a geographic detail. The genetic evidence is consistent with the enormous statue carving tradition, the culture responsible for the towering stone figures found on the most isolated eastern islands, originating from that single common point. Think about what that means. The same small population responsible for one of the most staggering feats of prehistoric maritime navigation in human history may also be the common ancestral source of one of the most iconic monumental art traditions on the planet. One migration wave, one cultural seed, scattered across a third of the globe. At this point, you might think the story has reached its peak. A dual origin in Asia and Melanesia, a precisely reconstructed settlement path across the remote Pacific, a shared ancestral link to legendary statue-building cultures. Surely that's the whole picture. But here's where everything changes, because the DNA had one more secret buried inside it, and this one didn't just complicate the story of Polynesia. It reached across an entire ocean and pulled in a continent nobody had seriously expected to be part of this at all. For a long time, the idea that ancient Polynesians made contact with the Americas, long before any European ship crossed the Pacific, was treated by many scholars as speculative, even fringe. It sounded like the kind of theory built on enthusiasm rather than evidence. Thor Heyerdahl's famous raft voyages captured public imagination decades ago, but they proved a journey was physically possible, not that it had actually happened. What was missing was proof written into human biology itself, and then DNA delivered exactly that. A team of researchers, led by geneticists Alexander Ioannidis and Andres Moreno Estrada, set out to answer this question with hard genomic data rather than speculation. They analyzed DNA from 807 individuals spanning 17 Polynesian island populations, alongside 15 indigenous groups from the Pacific coast of Central and South America, comparing genetic segments across more than 7,000 kilometers of open ocean. This wasn't a small pilot study. This was one of the largest genomic investigations of its kind ever conducted across this stretch of the Pacific. And what they found should have been impossible under the old assumptions. Segments of Native American ancestry showed up inside Polynesian genomes, not vague, ambiguous traces that could be explained away by chance or by more recent colonial era mixing, but genetic fingerprints specific enough to be traced to a particular indigenous population. The closest match pointed toward a Native American group related to present-day indigenous communities in Colombia. Read that again? Colombia. On the other side of the largest ocean on Earth from where these DNA segments were found. This is where the timeline turns the story upside down. The genetic evidence placed this contact as early as around the year 1150, nearly 2 centuries earlier than a previous 2014 study had estimated, with the earliest detectable trace of admixture appearing on Fatu Hiva, an island in the South Marquesas. 1350, 1150. Either way, this was centuries before Christopher Columbus ever set sail, centuries before any European vessel entered the Pacific. This wasn't colonial era mixing dressed up as ancient contact. This was genuine, deep history contact between two branches of humanity that most people assumed had no way of ever meeting. But here's the part that turns this from a fascinating footnote into a genuine unsolved mystery. Nobody actually knows for certain which direction that contact happened. Did Polynesian voyagers, already proven capable of crossing thousands of kilometers of open ocean to settle the Tuamotus and Rapanui, simply keep going east until they hit the coast of South America, then carry Indigenous American companions and the sweet potato back home with them? Or did Indigenous South Americans, using vessels history has almost entirely failed to document, cross the same brutal stretch of ocean in the opposite direction, reaching Polynesian shores first? Even the researchers who ran the study acknowledged this question remains open. And the mystery deepens further once you zoom into a single island. Consider Rapanui, Easter Island, the most isolated of them all. Archaeological evidence suggests the island was settled by around the year 1200. But the genetic signature of Native American ancestry inside the Rapanui population doesn't appear until decades later. Researchers determined the admixture event on Rapanui itself likely didn't occur until around 1380, even though the island had already been inhabited for roughly 180 years by that point. Think about what that implies. This wasn't one single moment of contact radiating out simultaneously across the Pacific. This was a staggered, multi-stage process. Contact happening first somewhere else, likely further west, with Native American ancestry then spreading gradually, island by island, before finally reaching the most remote outpost of them all. At this point, the old idea of the Pacific as an impassable boundary between Asia-derived populations and the Americas was already looking obsolete, but the story wasn't finished, because everything up to this point had been reconstructed from the DNA of people alive today, descendants, generations removed from the actual events. What happened next came from something far more direct, DNA extracted straight from the bones of people who lived through it. In a study published in Nature, researchers sequenced the genomes of 15 ancient Rapanui individuals, people who lived on Easter Island between the years 1670 and 1950, spanning the era just before and after European contact. And this ancient DNA didn't just confirm what the living population studies had suggested. It went further, dismantling one of the most famous and most repeated stories ever told about this island. For years, the dominant narrative about Rapa Nui was a cautionary tale of self-destruction. The idea that its inhabitants had overexploited their own environment, stripped the island of its forests, and triggered a catastrophic population collapse well before Europeans ever arrived. It became a popular metaphor, referenced constantly as a warning about ecological overreach. But the ancient genomes told a different story entirely. The genetic data showed a population that grew steadily and stably from the 13th century all the way through to European contact in the 18th century, directly contradicting the idea of a dramatic pre-contact collapse. The society that built and maintained those enormous stone statues was not a civilization in freefall. It was resilient. It endured. And the same ancient genomes delivered a second bombshell. The distribution of Indigenous American ancestry within these individuals' genetic backgrounds was consistent with contact occurring somewhere between the 13th and 15th centuries, meaning this wasn't a byproduct of European colonization at all, but something that happened long before any European ship reached these waters. For years, some assumed that any trace of Native American ancestry inside Rapa Nui populations must have arrived through the colonial slave trade and forced migrations of the 19th century, a grim, well-documented chapter in the island's history. The ancient DNA proved that assumption wrong. This ancestry was already there, generations before European contact, embedded in the bones of people who lived and died without ever seeing a European sail on the horizon. One of the researchers involved summed up what this actually means for how we should think about these voyages. This data strongly suggests that Rapa Nui and Indigenous Americans met and mixed centuries before Europeans made contact with either group, and that Rapa Nui navigators were capable of even more extraordinary Pacific voyages than previously believed. Let that sink in for a moment. The most isolated inhabited place on Earth, a tiny volcanic speck surrounded by thousands of kilometers of open ocean in every direction, was not a dead end. It was a waypoint on a much larger network of contact that historians spent centuries assuming simply could not have existed. This is where the consequences of this discovery ripple outward, far beyond one island. If Polynesian navigators, or their Indigenous American counterparts, really did cross this stretch of the Pacific centuries before Columbus, it forces a complete reassessment of what isolation actually meant in the pre-modern world. The version of history most people grew up with treats the ocean as a wall, something that divided civilizations, until European ships finally stitched the world together during the so-called Age of Exploration. But what this genetic evidence suggests is that the wall had already been breached quietly centuries earlier by people wielding nothing but wooden canoes, celestial navigation, and an almost incomprehensible understanding of currents and stars. And the story of that breach was never written down. It was inherited silently inside human DNA, waiting 500 years to be read. But before this turns into a tidy, triumphant conclusion, here's the twist that keeps this mystery genuinely unresolved. Despite years of searching, no Polynesian DNA from that era has ever been found in South America itself. Not a single confirmed trace on the continent side of the equation of the people who supposedly made this journey or received these visitors. Every piece of evidence so far comes from the Polynesian side of the ocean. The Native American genetic signature shows up clearly inside Polynesian genomes, both ancient and modern, but the reverse has not been confirmed. And that absence matters enormously because it means the full picture of exactly how this contact happened is still incomplete. Some researchers have raised an even stranger possibility to explain the gap, that the trans-Pacific vessel involved might not have originated in South America or Polynesia at all, but instead came from somewhere else entirely, carried by currents and voyagers whose full story has been lost. Others push back hard against that idea, pointing out how little historical or archaeological evidence exists for sophisticated ocean-capable watercraft construction among the specific Indigenous American groups genetically linked to this event, which makes some researchers skeptical that the voyage originated on the American side at all. And that disagreement itself tells you something important. Even among the scientists closest to this discovery, there is no consensus yet on who made the crossing or in which direction. So consider both scenarios side by side because either one is almost unbelievable on its own. Scenario 1, Polynesian navigators, already proven capable of settling the most remote islands on Earth using nothing but open ocean voyaging canoes, simply kept sailing east for thousands of additional kilometers, made landfall somewhere on the Pacific coast of South America, made contact, and then turned around and sailed all the way back, carrying new genetic ancestry, and quite possibly the sweet potato, a crop with clear South American origins that somehow ended up as a staple across the Pacific Islands long before European contact. Scenario 2, Indigenous people from the coast of what is now Colombia, using vessels that left almost no trace in the archaeological or historical record, launched themselves onto the open Pacific and successfully navigated more than 7,000 kilometers of featureless ocean to reach a scattering of tiny islands most modern sailors would struggle to find without GPS. Neither scenario is simple. Both require a level of maritime capability that conventional history has consistently underestimated for one side or the other. And searching for the missing piece of this puzzle is not easy either. The genetic evidence of contact, if it exists at all on the South American mainland, would be buried inside the DNA of a vast and diverse continental population, diluted over 800 years of subsequent history, colonization, and demographic upheaval. Finding a single confirmed signal in that noise is a genuinely difficult scientific problem, and researchers are still actively working on it. What most people are not seeing in all of this is how much the story keeps changing shape every single time new data arrives. A decade ago, the confirmed narrative was simple. Polynesians came from Asia, full stop. Then genetics revealed the hidden Melanesian layer folded into that migration. Then a reconstructed settlement path showed the staggering speed and precision of the eastward expansion across the remote Pacific. Then living population DNA revealed Native American ancestry embedded inside Polynesian genomes, centuries before Columbus. And then ancient DNA, pulled directly from the bones of people who lived through it, confirmed that this contact predated European arrival and dismantled a decades-old myth about societal collapse on Easter Island in the same breath. Each layer of this story was hiding underneath the one before it, and every time researchers thought they had reached the bottom, the genome offered up something else. That pattern alone should make anyone cautious about assuming the current version of events is the final one. Ancient DNA research is still a relatively young field. Samples from South America's Pacific coast remain limited, and the technology for extracting and analyzing degraded genetic material keeps improving year after year, which means the specific question hanging over everything right now, who actually crossed that ocean first and in which direction, is not a question historians have failed to answer. It's a question the evidence has not yet allowed anyone to answer, one way or the other. And that leaves us exactly where this entire investigation into Polynesian origins keeps circling back to: a population whose ancestry was never as simple as one migration, one homeland, or one direction of travel. A people who fused Asian maternal lineage with Melanesian paternal lineage over generations of contact most history books never mention. A people who then executed one of the most audacious waves of exploratory navigation in human history, using nothing but wooden canoes and knowledge of stars and currents to conquer the largest ocean on the planet in roughly 500 years. And then, somewhere along that journey, in a moment the written historical record completely missed, they crossed paths with a civilization on the other side of the world's biggest ocean, leaving a genetic signature that would sit hidden and unread for 8 centuries, until a lab finally had the tools to hear what the DNA had been saying all along. The question that remains is not whether this contact happened. The evidence for that is no longer seriously disputed. The question is what else is still buried in there, waiting. Somewhere on the Pacific coast of South America, in a burial site nobody has excavated yet, or in a genome nobody has sequenced yet. There may be the missing half of this story, the confirmation of exactly who sailed toward whom and why. Until that piece surfaces, the full truth of how 2 branches of humanity, separated by the largest ocean on Earth, found each other centuries before anyone thought it was possible, remains one of the most compelling unsolved mysteries hiding inside the human genome.